In this recording, I want to talk to you about consequences of language death and what the process typically looks like. It is quite common, and according to some estimates, 60% of the world's languages today are threatened with extinction. I have an example for you. Manx was a Celtic language spoken on the Isle of Man. And in 1874, according to census reports, there were 12,000 speakers of this language. So it was still the primary native language of many inhabitants of the island. But in just 100 years, the language disappeared entirely. And in 1974, the last living speaker passed away. So, how or why does this happen? We can also talk about other examples of dead languages that we know, such as Latin. And I want you to think about what it must be like to be the speaker of a dying language, or even the last speaker, right? So your natural way of speaking, the way you tell jokes, the way you use idiomatic expressions, it means that there are fewer and fewer, and eventually no other people that you can do that with. I'm going to quickly go through these slides that you can read on your own in the slideshow, in the PowerPoint, in the resources for Sakai. In a nutshell, the documentation of this speaker talks about the life of Ned Madrell, who, his personal story just gives us a close-up look at what happens when languages die out. And like many people in Man, he went to sea at age 13 to find his livelihood, and he was able to continue to speak Manx by talking to other sailors, mostly on British ships, but whose native tongue was this Gaelic language, or closely related to Gaelic, called Manx. He was brought up in this remote village in the island, where everybody spoke Manx, where English, which had swept through larger cities, had not become the common language that people used to get around. So he had to use Manx just to do his daily business. However, in the towns, people were interested in um, having a life outside of the island. They wanted to become modern, and the way to do that was to speak English. They also wanted to seek greater economic fortune, and that too was associated with English. And so English was what families wanted to adopt for their young people, in the hopes of giving them the best chances for success and a new life. So there are other examples of places where people have tried to preserve dying languages. Of course, once they cease to exist and the last speaker dies, that it's pretty much impossible, although we will talk about a single possible exception that we know about. But in some cases, societies know that their language, their sort of indigenous language, doesn't have a lot of time left. That all of the speakers are elderly, and that if they don't do something in policy or education to turn the situation around, the language will cease to be spoken. And one great example is Gaelic in Ireland. So Gaelic was spoken in Ireland before Ireland became a territory of Great Britain. Great Britain took over and imposed English for a couple of generations in an extremely heavy-handed way. So they had these very harsh policies that actually punished schools or even households for using their native language. They were hoping to culturally and linguistically assimilate the island by pushing English on everyone, and it kind of worked, right? So very quickly, Ireland became an English speaking country, as it largely is today. But especially in villages and rural parts of Ireland, there were still people who spoke Gaelic. And Ireland is now an independent nation. And so, beginning in like the 60s and 70s, there was this big effort to try to revive the use of Gaelic and hopefully start having young people, new people speak it again as a native language. And so they were very serious and very smart about this, as the language is such an important part of cultural and societal identity. So, part of being Irish was having some notion of this Gaelic language. So, one of the things that they did was to officially recognize Irish language, which is Gaelic, in the constitution of the nation. And so Gaelic is actually the first official language of the Republic of Ireland. Um, and so it has co-official status, with English being the second official language. Now, that becomes kind of in name only because, in fact, the majority of Irish citizens at the time and still today do not speak Gaelic. Or maybe they just know a tiny bit. And so this started out as a very symbolic thing to do, to say we put our identity and heritage first. But then they took some other steps that were important as well. They started Irish language programs in the preschools. And again, this began in the 70s. Now, decades later, it has yielded good results, and they're beginning to turn the situation around, where we have a generation, now two generations, of young folks in not all the schools, but many schools, who speak both Irish and English fluently. So that sort of thing is kind of a fairy tale. It worked in a place like Ireland, where they had the money to make a whole curriculum and set of writing materials in this language that didn't previously have those materials. They had the money and the political will and support of the public to train a whole lot of teachers to be able to teach Gaelic and teach in Gaelic for immersion programs. Not every place can do that. It is very costly. It's financially and politically expensive, but it's something that many places have to consider. And why would this even be important? So I do like to try to take a sort of devil's advocate point of view from time to time, and ask this kind of nasty question, um, which is why bother? Why not just let languages die? So I do want you to think about that. Of course, why is it nasty? Well, because my native language is English, and I'm from North America, and I happen to be speaking one of those languages that is nowhere near the brink of extinction, and won't be anytime soon. Right, so it's easy for me to say, like, well, why not just let your little language die, since it doesn't really, quote unquote, get you anywhere anyway. Well, then the scientist in me sort of kicks in. We do lose important things when a language is lost. Of course, we lose cultural knowledge. So there are things that we know are, especially artistically, creatively, that can't be conveyed through direct translation, or not easily. Something is lost when we translate cultural and artistic expressions. And then, very concretely, geographical knowledge is lost. especially in the case of islands or remote places, knowledge of local flora and fauna and terrain and places often exists in the native indigenous language that was or is there. And so when we lose that language, we have the real risk of losing knowledge of those places and things. Um, and then importantly, I would add as a linguist, and this is the scientific brain kicking in, we lose an important piece of data about how language in general can work, right? So if we think of every separate language as another instantiation of how the language system can manifest, every time a language dies, we lose that variety, right? So that loss of linguistic diversity gives us that much less data that helps us understand how language with a capital L works. So I'd like to know what you all think. In some places, people try to preserve dying languages in a very aggressive way. What do you think? On the face of it, should dying languages be artificially preserved through early education programs? Thank you for listening.